There's pieces of clothing, newspaper articles. There's just all kinds of there's all kinds of things in there.
Yeah, kudos to them for keeping track of all these documents because lots of people have stories. So the historian in me says hats off to them for being able to keep a record of all of this.
Well, my grandfather, Mac, started keeping records, so he kept the land deeds. And then as my great-grandfather, did I say my grandfather? My great-grandfather, Mac, kept those land deeds. My grandfather, John Chester, kept photographs and added on, whatever he could add on.
Well, I'd one other question before we get to your story of confirming your descendancy of Madison with DNA testing. Let's compare this to the case of Thomas Jefferson. And even at the end of his life, there were whispers that he had produced offspring with Sally Hemings. And I think it might have been the presidential election or the race against John Adams that was ugly. There were all sorts of accusations and things said in newspapers, and Jefferson's offspring was mentioned at one point. And from what I know, there were always murmurings and questions about his offspring from Sally Hemings, and Sally Hemings' family would say it. And then in the 1990s, there was DNA evidence that confirmed somebody from Jefferson's male line did indeed have relations and produce offspring with Sally Hemings. In your family's case, was there ever this sort of historical interest in James Madison and questions whether he also fathered a child with someone on his estate, or was this mostly contained within your family until recently?
I believe it was mostly contained within my family. There weren't rumors that I'm aware of, political issues that were thrown out about that. The situations were similar in that Thomas Jefferson also didn't have male children by his wife. I was just pausing to try to remember her name. It doesn't come to me right now.
Yeah, I was having the same problem earlier. I was thinking Martha. No, it's not Martha. What is it? I'm sure there are some listeners just slamming their heads against the computer like, it's this. But sorry, listeners, this happens to the best of us.
Okay. But he also did not have a Y chromosome to pass. I mean, he didn't pass down the Y chromosome that could be used for this analysis that was done. It could only be done to Sally Hemings' children because Jefferson and his wife, what's her name, Catherine? But anyway, Jefferson and his wife only had daughters. And so it's similar because James Madison also didn't have sons with daughters for a DNA to be used to verify.
Okay, so let's get to the point where you begin doing research properly. What compelled you to take a DNA test? Did you think, okay, I want to finally get some verifiable science behind this family lore and get this certified? Was that the reason, or was there something else behind that?
No, I mean, I just I've always known that I was a Madison because from the time I was 4 or 5, I was told this. And, we have all these wonderful stories. It was a lot of interesting detail that kind of, support the legacy. But I thought it would be great to have, the DNA, which became, very popular, especially in the 90s, and even more so in my case after Sally Hemings' family was able to prove. So what I was to prove their stories. So what I did was I got I developed a relationship with Dr. Bruce Jackson, who actually passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a preeminent DNA geneticist who was interested in helping African Americans confirm their African lineages and also some of their American lineages. So what I did was I had 3 of my male cousins send cheek swabs to Dr. Jackson. I then tried to find a male descendant of the acknowledged the acknowledged Madisons who would be willing to submit a DNA swab so that we could compare. But what happened was I was told by the National Association of Madison Family Descendants that there was only one living male who had the appropriate genealogy. I was never given his name, but that man did agree to submit a DNA swab. Unfortunately, right after he agreed to do that, the Washington Post published an article about my quest, and he just shied away. He didn't want to get involved in some of the things that had happened with the Jeffersons, so he withdrew. And I tried a number of other ways to find a male DNA donor, but it wasn't successful. For example, there was a genealogist in England who was looking for a male descendant of an antecedent of those Madisons who came to America. The thought was that people in England would be more willing to participate because they wouldn't have any stigma associated with slavery. But his name was Ian Morrison, the geneticist, and he wasn't able to find a living male descendant. So it seems there's a lot of, or I don't know, but there's a number of female descendants, but not very many male descendants. So I kind of put that on the back burner. I think I will try to get back to it, but I became more and more interested in the slaves and their descendants and became more and more just inspired by them. And so that's where my book focuses. It focuses on what remarkable people my enslaved ancestors were. So did I go off too far off on a tangent there?
Well, there's a lot to unpack, so it definitely takes time to do that. A couple of follow-ups with that. I want to get into those stories that you mentioned there of the descendants of these slaves. One other thing before I forget, are there any other stories within your family lore concerning Madison and Coreen that really stick out to you?
No. You know, and one of the reasons is that this kind of sexual relationship really was avoided. Talking about it was avoided.
Right.
Like my grandfather was one who loved to tell stories. But whenever my mother would ask him about what happened between Mandy and Madison Sr., or what happened between Coreen and Madison Jr., he just wouldn't talk about it.
Right. Well, yeah, that definitely affects how information is passed on there. Well, concerning the rest of your family, then, you had talked about up to emancipation, and then we skipped ahead about a century and a half. As you were investigating your family tree and how it branches out, what were some surprising discoveries that you came across?
Well, Mandy was our first African ancestor in this country. Just her phenomenal strength. She believed in herself. She wouldn't tell anybody her real name. So I guess the most surprising thing there is that we've always called her Mandy, but that was not her name. She believed that by keeping her name secret, she could protect herself and protect her family. So she only allowed anyone to know that her slave name. So that was a surprise. I'm trying to think of other things that were surprising. I mean, I just think it's phenomenal that Elizabeth and Emmanuel ended up having some 12 or so children. It's not exactly known how many they had because some probably died, some were sold away. But when they were sent from Tennessee to Texas, the whole family was able to stay together. So that's a bit of a surprise because it was very common to just break up families. And this family almost got broken up because Jefferson Billingsley, who was the original owner, had planned to split them up and give them to different members of his own family. But the emancipation, so his second will was in 1862, and he was going to split up the family. But he died after the Emancipation Proclamation, so he did not succeed in doing that. I guess it's surprising too that all the girls died, and so we ended up with this 8 boys.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
One follow-up with Emmanuel's Family. I'm very interested in that they stayed together because when I've read accounts of former slaves that came out of these interviews in the 1930s with elderly people who had been emancipated in the 1860s, it sounds like something I notice over and over again is the most heartrending thing. It's not necessarily the physical abuse, although that is traumatic to many people. It really is the separation of families that seem to break people's hearts above all. But Emmanuel's family stayed together. So how do you think they were able to stay together when that wasn't the case for so many others?
Well, they all ended up working on Jefferson Billingsley's plantation. And so initially when they were moved, there were just, the four oldest kids that were transferred. And then Elizabeth and Emmanuel kept having kids, and the kids could work on that plantation too. So I think it was probably just economics. So he didn't have to buy more slaves, have Elizabeth have more children. After emancipation, they all stayed in the same area. They stayed in the Travis County and Bastrop County areas. So they were initially taken to Cedar Creek, Texas, which is in Bastrop County. And then after emancipation, some of them moved to Austin, which is in Travis County. And there is still in Austin a slave cabin. It was actually not a slave cabin, but it was a cabin that was built in 1863 by one of my great uncle Henry. And it's still there as sort of a testimony to the strength of this family. I've been there about 3 times now, but the first time I went, I walked around the cabin. I couldn't get in, but I was trying to figure out how to get in and try to peek through the shuttered windows. And, I touched these logs and I touched the mortar, and I could just feel the strength and the determination of Henry to build a home